Hello, everybody. I hope it's a nice night where you are. It's beautiful here on the shores of Lake St. Clair in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. This is Our American Values, conversations with distinguished guests about important subjects presented by the Grosse Pointe War Memorial Association in partnership with the Ford Institute for Leadership in Public Policy and Service at Albion College. We're grateful to the Ford Institute for that. And we're grateful to have with us tonight the director of the Ford Institute, Patrick McLean. Hi, Patrick.
Ted, always nice to see you. Always nice to be working with you. We are very happy to partner with you, and we are also grateful to David Shipler for joining us this evening. So I simply wanted to introduce myself and on behalf of the Ford Institute and Albion College, welcome everybody to this month's program. And I look forward to working with you on future programs as well, Ted.
Absolutely, Patrick. Thank you. We also have from Albion College a couple of students. Mickey Benson, wave at us so we'll know who you are. Mickey is a junior. Pardon me, Mickey's a senior. The junior in the group is Jerry Hodsma. Jerry, I forgot to ask where each of you is from.
I'm from Battle Creek, Michigan.
Okay.
And I'm from Portland, Oregon.
Portland, Oregon. Well, welcome. And tonight's subject is journalism separating news, analysis, and editorial opinion. An important and certainly timely subject. And with us to discuss that is David Shipler. David is the author of 7 books, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction, and a former correspondent for the New York Times. Graduate of Dartmouth College, he served as an officer on a U.S. Navy destroyer from 1964 to 1966. He began as a news clerk at the Times, worked as a reporter in the New York City office, then spent 11 years overseas as a Times correspondent in Saigon and as bureau chief in Moscow and Jerusalem. He concluded his career at the Times as chief diplomatic correspondent in Washington. He and Thomas Friedman shared the 1983 George Polk Award for their coverage of the war in Lebanon. He's written, he writes online and at the Shipler Report. His first book, first of 7, was Russia, Broken Idols, Solemn Dreams. It was a national bestseller and the winner of the Overseas Press Club Award. His next book, Arab and Jew, Wounded Spirits in the Promised Land, won the Pulitzer, and a 2-hour PBS documentary based on that book, for which he was executive producer, writer, and narrator, won the DuPont Columbia Award for Broadcast Journalism. That was followed by a 1-hour film, Arab and Jew, Return to the Promised Land, which also aired on PBS. David's other books are A Country of Strangers, Blacks and Whites in America, The Working Poor, Invisible in America, a national bestseller, The Rights of the People, How Our Search for Safety Invades Our Liberties, Rights at Risk, The Limits of Liberty in Modern America, and Freedom of Speech, Mightier Than the Sword. He also has published short fiction and poetry. David Shipler has taught at Princeton, Dartmouth, and American University. He's been a writer in residence at the University of Southern California, a Woodrow Wilson Fellow on more than 25 campuses, a trustee of Dartmouth College, from which he graduated. He's also been a visiting scholar at the Brookings Institution, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a member and chair of the Pulitzer Jury for General Nonfiction. David, it is an honor to have you with us and to talk to us about this important and certainly timely subject.
Thanks very much, Ted. I'm delighted to be with you all, and I appreciate it. I wish I could be there in person, but you know how it is. We're in the middle of COVID, so hopefully at some point I'll get out there. I'm betting on it. I'm going to start by reading the First Amendment, which seems appropriate because there are only 2 institutions that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution, private institutions, as having particular protections. One is religion and the other is the press. So just to remind us, here it is. And by the way, I keep a copy of the Constitution on my desk, and I refer to it rather frequently. It did, especially when I was working on my civil liberties books. So anyway, here's the First Amendment, just to remind you. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's that careful, strange, difficult balance, isn't it? Creating a authorized religion versus not impeding the religion. We still struggle with trying to find the middle ground or the balance between those two, or to at least to respect both parts of that provision. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So we understand, I think, looking at history and looking around the world at the present, that every dictator has tried to suppress the press. You can't have dictatorship with a free press. They just don't coexist. And when there is an authoritarian impulse, even in the United States at the highest level during, with our last president, the First Amendment prevented censorship, but it induced President Trump to try to undermine the authority of the press in the eyes of the people. He talked about fake news, by which I think he meant news coverage that was somewhat adverse to him. And he labeled journalists as enemies of the people, enemies of the people. Now, anyone, I'm sure most of you know the history of that phrase. That phrase has a chilling effect because it comes from Lenin, from Mao, and especially from Stalin, who used it as a criminal charge and conviction under which he sent millions of Russians into the gulag or before firing squads, enemies of the people. So the undermining of credibility in the press, the legitimacy of the press, undermining belief in the press, is kind of like a second tier effort to suppress open news coverage. If you can't do it at its source, then you try to do it in the minds of the people. And it has succeeded, I think, to a large extent. We can talk about that a little bit, why the credibility of the press has decreased over the years. It didn't start with Trump. He rode the wave. So I just want to go into a few elements of coverage as I experienced them as a reporter, to give you a sense of what the standards ought to be, what you ought to look for as a consumer, as a reader, as a viewer, as a listener, and then talk a little bit about some of my experiences navigating this whole field, which is not always easy to do. Just this morning, by chance, a Dartmouth economics professor put out a report that was it was written about in the New York Times, finding that during COVID, the media were emphasizing bad news, even when there was some good news. And it wasn't that they were suppressing information or distorting it particularly. It was a matter of emphasis. Where's the emphasis? Is the emphasis on the solutions that are coming up, the vaccines and so forth, or on the high rates of death and cases and all of that? And they did an analysis. I haven't read the original report, but I gather they concluded that the news media generally were emphasizing the negative. Well, let's face it, news organizations report on problems. That's what they do. That's their idea. That's their concept. Because problems need to be turned out into the sunlight to be cured. In a free society, you have to be open and honest about reporting on problems. I mean, I was in the Soviet Union for 4 years where there were no problems. Everything was just great. There was no crime. There was no hardship. There was no poverty. There was no racial or ethnic discrimination. The official press, which was all government controlled, pretty much towed the line. You could, in certain specialized journals, read between the lines and ferret out descriptions and discussions of certain problems. But by and large, it was a good news society. It was a good news press. Well, good news is great. I'm all for good news, but Uh, Good news is does not usually find its way into prominence in media coverage. After all, we all understand that if 362 airplanes landed safely in Detroit today, that's not a story. But if one crashes, that's a story. The story recently in from Boulder, Colorado, was not the number of people in that grocery store who were not shot, but the number of people who were. War coverage is very much like that. I've covered a couple of wars, and it's clear to me that when you live in a situation where a war is going on, most people get up in the morning, they have breakfast, they brush their teeth, they go to work. It's pockets of violence and areas of conflict and combat which get the coverage, and that's where the television cameras go. Is that wrong? Well, it can be considered perhaps a little distorting, because I think it's important to understand, for everyone to understand also, that war is a condition which is not always all encompassing. Now, there were situations in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, where whole towns, whole areas were under constant barrage. People were suffering all the time from being in combat. But on the other hand, in other parts of the country, life was going on pretty much as usual without lots of strife. So the press focuses on problems, and as it should, because as I said, the concept of a free press is to turn the problems out into the sunlight. That is a necessary but not sufficient step. You can't have cures without knowing what the problem is. You can't resolve problems without defining them. But it's not sufficient for the press, because after all, we journalists just, report. We turn it out into the sunlight, but somebody else has to pick it up then and do something with it. So if you do an expose, an investigation of corruption or something, then it's up to authorities to rectify the situation. Mark Danner some years ago referred with lament to what he called the frozen scandals. That is, scandals that were exposed but then froze before anyone did anything about them and tried to resolve them. I think we in this country actually have experienced that in a way. That is, the threshold that you have to reach before becoming outraged enough to take action has risen higher and higher and higher, to the point where egregious activity by government has to occur before there is real action. I mean, the New York Times, I don't work for the New York Times anymore, and I haven't for many years, but I do still admire the paper, because it has done a lot of investigative stories in which nothing happened at the end. I mean, I actually did a big investigation when I was a fairly young reporter in New York, and I was covering housing. I investigated corruption in the construction industry in New York, and construction heads told me in great detail about the litany of bribes that they had to pay. I mean, there were almost, you could have written them down on a spreadsheet, how much it cost to get a certificate of occupancy, how much it cost to get a permit to operate a crane. The crane was standing there ready to go, having been assembled on a construction site, costing at that point, that was a long time ago, $2,000 a day for not even being used. So what they were paying for was for the building inspectors to come on time or early or soon or quickly to give them the permit, so they wouldn't have to wait for weeks in order to do it. Police departments would come around every Friday and collect bribes, so they wouldn't have an officer stand at the sidewalk and write a summons every time a dump truck went in and out of the construction site, dumping a little dirt on the sidewalk. In fact, I came to the conclusion that it was impossible to build a building in New York without violating the law, and that the bribery was just kind of to grease the whole machinery. Well, after this series came out, it was on the front page. It made a big splash. There were lots of discussions about what to do. What I was told by the heads of construction companies was that the only impact was to raise the price that they had to pay, because building inspectors and police officers were then a little nervous since they'd been put into the spotlight. So they felt that their heightened risk, had to be compensated for with higher bribes, which gets to a point I'm going to come back to later, which is that a reporter can't think about the impact of a story except to turn the problem out into the sunlight. You can't really predict what's going to happen as a result very often. And in any case, this is the issue. You turn a problem out into the sunlight, you focus on it. You then think that, well, in a free society, in a democratic system where people really have interests in solving problems and making the society self-correcting, something will be done. And that sometimes happens, but often it does not happen. It does add to the reservoir of knowledge in the country at large. And sometimes it takes a long, long time to have an impact. For example, I think now in the poverty area with this new Biden administration rescue plan, the bill that was just passed, the $1.9 trillion bill, there are some fundamental conceptual changes in the way government addresses poverty, namely by increasing cash payments to families with children, especially, which will have a much better impact on malnutrition, which affects cognitive development in children and so forth, something I'm just in the process of writing about now, we're researching and writing about. It will have a big impact, I think. And that's something that's a kind of a realization, a recognition that the experts in the country have understood for many years. It's been written about repeatedly. I wrote about it in my book, The Working Poor. But the concept finally has filtered up into the policymaking area and into Congress to an extent, anyway, the Democrats in Congress. So you begin to figure that the accumulating knowledge will ultimately have an impact, even though it doesn't have it happen right away or directly. So let me talk about my standards as a reporter, what I tried to do when I was covering the news on a daily basis and in my books as well. I think if you bear these standards in mind, it might help you to read the press or view the reports, the news organizations, the television, hear the radio reports, look online to see what's reporting. It might help you to analyze them a little better and to think about whether they're meeting these standards. So here's my formula, a few things in my formula. First of all, it's worth saying that the media, what we call the media, someone once likened to food. There's a lot of food that's really nutritious and good for you, and there's a lot of food that's really bad for you, but fun to eat. News media are kind of like that. There are lots of things that online and in the main news organizations, it's really fun and entertaining to listen to or read, kind of scandalous and gossipy, full of conspiracy theories. That's like, junk food. And then there are the responsible news organizations, and I do count the New York Times in that group, although I have some criticisms of the Times, which I'm happy to share with you if you'd like. I would count the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, NPR, the PBS NewsHour, and sometimes, not always, sometimes the straight news reporting on Fox, MSNBC, and CNN, and the major networks too, CBS, NBC, ABC, the major broadcast networks, sometimes, not always. And then there are specialized websites, which I think do a pretty good job of trying to report the news in a fairly straight manner. Politico is one, and so forth. So the standards I look for are several. First of all, as a reporter, I always felt that accuracy was the most important. In fact, if it's not accurate, nothing else matters. It's got to be accurate. And accuracy means double checking, triple checking your facts in as quick a time as you can, because on a daily newspaper even, but then even more so in a wire service or on a website where there's no deadline really, it's all every minute is a deadline. You don't always have time to check everything. In fact, it's a kind of rule of thumb that if there's a disaster happening, an earthquake, a hurricane, a shooting, something like that, you can be pretty sure that the initial facts will not be always completely accurate. The numbers of deaths, for example, most news organizations that are responsible will say at least X number of people, because the numbers increase often after the fact. So when you have a couple of hours at the most to do the reporting, the chances are that there are going to be mistakes made. And the key is to withhold definitive statements about what has happened until you really know. Or say openly, and I tried to do this in my own reporting, you see it rarely in news organizations, it was not known whether, or the full death toll was not clear, or officials were not sure, or, something about the unknowns, which tell the audience that there are things that you just simply don't know yet. So that's the main thing. You've got to be accurate. You've got to be completely right and correct. Without that, the news coverage is useless, and worse than useless, it's actually misleading and damaging. So then, to go from the title of my talk, I always thought of, and do now as a reader and consumer of news, that it has three basic dimensions: straight news, analysis, and editorial opinion. So let's take one example. The news is that Congress passed the 1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. The news is what it contains: how much for this, how much for that, how much for the other thing. The news is all the Democrats in the Senate voted for it, all the Republicans voted against it. Okay, that's the news. The analysis is, what will be the impact of that $1.9 trillion on ordinary Americans who have suffered during this pandemic? What will the impact be? Will it direct money to those who don't need it? There were some changes made to try to eliminate that problem. Will it address poverty, as I was mentioning before, and in what, how significantly? It's a 1-year tax credit for children. What happens during that year, and what happens if it's not renewed for a longer period of time? What are the implications of the way the vote took place in Congress for the lack of bipartisanship? What does that mean in terms of the political landscape going forward on a whole range of other issues? So that's the analysis. These are, and you can get in the analysis conflicting views and ideas about, what the impact is going to be. And those two things, news and analysis, have every right to be in a news story about what happened. It's perfectly legitimate, in my view, for the reporter to give analysis, but it is not legitimate for the reporter to give his or her opinion. So take that level opinion. What's opinion in this case? Well, opinion would be, it was a momentous and excellent bill. It really was the right thing to do at this time, and so forth. Or on the other side, it was a defective bill for this or that reason. It will rescue. It will actually cost millions, trillions of dollars. It will create inflation economically, and also in what you might call inflation governmentally. This would be the conservative view that government should be kept small and not vast and huge, the way this bill would kind of turn it into. So those are the opinions. Those opinions don't have any place in a news story unless they're expressed by other people. So it's perfectly fine to quote members of Congress on each side of the issue, or experts on each side of the issue. I mean, you can find economists, excuse me, who will say, oh, this is not going to contribute to inflation it's not really a danger in that regard. And you can find other economists who say, oh yeah, watch out. This is going to start to, really fuel inflation, and that's going to be damaging. So you can include opinion in the story. And in fact, it's probably worth doing, but not your own. My feeling always was, as a New York Times reporter, that people bought the newspaper not to find out what Shipler thought, but find out what happened and what was going on. In that regard, I also tried to get inside people's minds to the extent that I possibly could, or possibly that they would let me, to report on their motivations. Why are people doing this? Why are they saying this? Why are they behaving this way? Why are they adopting certain policies? Excuse me. If I covered Congress, I would certainly like to talk to members of Congress on each side of the aisle to try to get a sense of why they favored or opposed this bill. What were their calculations? What were their concerns? What was driving them? Were they hearing from constituents on one side or the other? Were they afraid of on the Democratic side of the progressives in their districts who were going to, get on their case if they didn't pass something like this? Or on the Republican side, afraid of the conservatives who were worried that this was, once again, big government, overreaching, getting government too involved in people's lives, whatever the arguments were, you'd really want to find out what was driving people, and also what business thought about it, what community organizers thought, what anti-poverty workers thought about it, what physicians thought about it. I mentioned I was working on a piece about malnutrition, childhood malnutrition, and the cognitive impairment that creates down through their years. So I was just interviewing a doctor who helps to run a malnutrition clinic in Boston. And she's very excited about this bill that was just passed, because she really feels that, as one of her colleagues says, policy is felt on the bodies of my patients. She's seen this happen over the years, that when benefits are increased, children come in healthier, with less malnutrition and so forth. So, talking to experts is really important too, and finding out what they're seeing. So that's all part of the process, I think, of being a responsible journalist. And if you read reporting, you want to be looking for that, I think, all that kind of thing. You should really be kind of sifting through the reports to see if they if they meet those standards, if they meet those criteria. Now, one thing that's happened in the last few years is that I think a lot of journalism has become much more opinionated. And that's sad to me. I don't like it. First of all, I feel somewhat offended, because I think I'm capable of making up my own mind. Thank you. Give me the facts. Tell me what's going on. I can come to my own conclusions. So I really get annoyed when I watch a lot of cable news, and you have people, basically hectoring you, telling you what they think all the time, and by implication, what you're supposed to think. I'm much more interested in news coverage that delves into the issues and gets different viewpoints. I think the PBS NewsHour does that. I record it every night. I watch it when I can. I think the NPR shows, National Public Radio shows, do it pretty well. Not always. Sometimes they slip, but by and large, I think they're pretty straight, and they give different viewpoints. I think the New York Times does it, but I have been dismayed when I've seen opinion sort of creep into the news columns in ways that aren't necessary. I remember a long investigation the Times did of Trump's tax issues. They got a hold of his tax returns, I guess, or at least summaries of his tax returns. And it was a very fact-based report by and large. It really did it had lots of links to documents. It was very detailed. It was quite interesting in looking at the ways in which he and his family manipulated the tax laws, actually, kind of maybe bordered on fraud in terms of the way they reported their assessments or appraisals of their property for certain purposes, and and all that, set up a shell company to do maintenance on their apartment houses, which then inflated the value or the expense of new furnaces and so forth. They could get a bigger tax deduction. I mean, there were all kinds of sort of hanky panky going on there, which the facts showed you. But in that story, if you go back and you read it, you'll see very loaded words. And I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I remember, kind of, just wincing when I came to that sentence or that phrase, because they were expressing opinions and judgments. And it was, well, first of all, it wasn't necessary. And I think it undermined the credibility of the report. I have a friend who is a fairly conservative friend, and he voted for Trump the first time. Actually, I haven't asked him how he voted the second time. He wasn't really happy with Trump, but he voted for Trump. And he told me when he reads something like that, as soon as he comes to that, that opinion, he discounts everything else, which is probably not fair, but nevertheless is a problem. And I think news organizations ought to recognize it. So anyway, that's my take on this. And I think that the problem has been that we've had a experience with Trump unlike any we've ever experienced. Journalism used to be, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. You constructed in your news story a forensics exercise, so to speak, a little debating exercise where you had people on each side of the issue, and sometimes there's more than one side, talking about it, and then you kind of triangulate all those views, and so you get a sense of the issues and the different opinions about them. When Trump started lying all the time, news organizations really faced a problem, because traditionally they had reported what officials said, and then maybe they would get someone to rebut it, but they didn't feel the necessity of doing fact checking and correcting the facts. And now when Trump was in office and he lied and lied and lied and lied, made stuff up, exaggerated all the time, the reporters and editors were kind of, well, what do we do here? There was a lot of criticism for the press of the mainstream, good, responsible news organizations early on in the Trump administration, actually even during the campaign. There was a lot of criticism because they just reported what he said. Well, what the president says is important. So traditionally, news organizations have reported it. And so the question was, how do you deal with this? And what the way they dealt with it, I think, was to start to characterize what he said as a lie, a fabrication, uncorroborated, and so forth. They used all kinds of different terminology to signal the reader that what they were about to read or what they had just read in a quote was absolutely not true, on which, the election steal, on which there was no evidence, and all that kind of stuff, that they started doing it as a shorthand. That process, which probably was unavoidable given the situation, kind of drove the press into an area of opinion writing, actually, of making judgments which reporters were never allowed to do before. I mean, any hint of a judgment on my part when I was working for the Times would be cut out by the editors. Really, I mean, it was just not permitted, period. So in a way, I think Trump contributed to a further drift toward opinionated journalism. And I noticed, I don't know how many of you watched Anderson Cooper over the years, but if you watched Anderson Cooper over the years, and I'm not a big CNN aficionado, but I've watched CNN from time to time, and especially when there's a major story breaking. And I watched Anderson Cooper, and I always thought he was a good, straight reporter, and he'd interview people, and he wouldn't express an opinion. And then during the Trump administration, he began to get increasingly opinionated, and to the point where he goes into rants now. And I don't like it. I'm old school journalist. I don't like it. But, I can understand what happened. it was not something that I applauded, but and I think there were better ways to handle it, frankly. But anyways, that's my sort of take on that. So it's important when you're reading, viewing, listening to identify opinion, recognize opinion versus the fact or the analysis. It's a mental exercise, a good challenge, keeps your brain working. So then I would say, I would make another point here, which is I was asked, I spoke to a group of Israeli high school teachers recently about journalism, and they were trying to figure out how to teach their students how to analyze journalists. And then one of the questions they asked was, should journalists be partisan on behalf of their country, their national interests? And my answer was unequivocal. It was no, primarily because I don't think it's in anyone's interest for that to happen. I think journalists ought to be devoted to reality and truth. It's a search for truth all the time. You're never quite there. People have different versions of the truth from their different perspectives. But I don't think journalists ought to be devoted to their national or community viewpoints. A foreign correspondent in another country certainly shouldn't. When I was covering Vietnam, when I was covering Israel, when I was covering the Soviet Union, I was not going to it from a perspective of promoting American interests, even though I'm an American. I don't think American reporters abroad should be pushing agendas of their own country, because they're writing for a readership that wants to know what's going on. And in fact, I'll give you a couple of examples where I don't think it was possible to do that and promote the idea of self-correction. That is, your own country's self-correction, and self-correction by the country that you're writing about, because at least at the New York Times, I can guarantee you the people in the countries I covered were very aware of what I was writing. In the Soviet Union, the Voice of America used to translate our pieces into Russian and broadcast them back into the Soviet Union. Lots of Russians listened, and I think my name was known better there than it was in New York, frankly. So it was important as a corrective to the censored Soviet press. In Vietnam one day, a couple of Mennonites who worked, American Mennonites who worked in Vietnam doing really good works there during the war, came to me and told me that there was a Vietnamese woman who was shackled to a hospital bed in a hospital. She was handcuffed and she'd been terribly tortured. So I went to interview her, and ultimately, in the context of a broader piece about political prisoners, I wrote about her without really knowing whether it was going to help her or hurt her, or whether it was going to help or hurt the American interests or South Vietnamese interests. Clearly, she was glad to be interviewed, actually. She welcomed my presence there. There are dissidents. I don't think she was a dissident. She was just picked up randomly and tortured. It was so bad, I'm not even going to tell you what happened to her. But she was, after I was there and reported to her, and Vietnamese secret police plainclothesman came up actually to me and interrupted the interview and said, what are you going to write about? I said, I don't know. What did she tell you? Oh, nothing much. And nothing happened, but she was released a short time afterwards, actually. So that I didn't expect, and that was good. That was obviously a good outcome. And in fact, just a few months ago, I heard from her. I met her when I went back in 1997, and we had lunch together. And then just a few months ago, she emailed me, and we touched base again. How's she doing? And we compared notes, and so it became a kind of, I'm not close to her, but it became a relationship or a friendship, or I don't know if you call it a friendship, but an acquaintance that went on for many years. when people are in danger, and I've written about a lot of people in danger, I've met a lot of people in a lot of countries who were at great risk. My rule of thumb was almost always, to let them make the calculation of whether they wanted to talk to me, whether they wanted their names used or not. I figured that as people in their country, vulnerable to the secret police, vulnerable to arrest, they were in a better position than I was to calculate the risk. Now, there were occasions in the Soviet Union, and I remember two, actually, I remember especially, where a couple of young Russians who were not dissidents got friendly with me on, in a kind of casual encounter, and wanted to continue having contact. And I had to say to them, I'm fine with it, but you have to understand, there's a KGB secret police officer outside my apartment house who takes note of everyone coming in or coming out. Our phones are certainly tapped. My apartment is probably bugged. So if you contact me, it will be known to the authorities. Now, one of these people, one was a young couple actually, and they were really a bit cavalier about it. And I did see them a few times. Nothing happened to them. But there was a young guy out in Central Asia who was a law student. And I happened to be in a restaurant where, in those days, I don't know how it is now, but in the Soviet Union in those days, when you went into a restaurant, they would often seat you at tables with other people that you didn't know. So I went in one evening to a restaurant. I was alone and in Dushanbe, and they seated me at a table with four graduate students. And they were kind of, like astonished to find an American at their table. And we got talking, and I got, then they said, well, can we meet tomorrow night? How long are you going to be here? I said, well, 3 nights. Can we meet tomorrow night? I said, sure. Can we meet tomorrow? And we did that. Some of them started dropping out. A young woman was a little bit more orthodox politically. She got nervous the second night. She didn't come. But the guy I kept in touch with was a law student. And he said he was going to be in Moscow at some point, and he'd love to get together with me. And I thought, this, like lots of Soviet citizens, he hadn't bumped up against the limits. So I said to him, that's fine. I would love to, but here's what you have to know. And I told him, the routine, the KGB guy, the phone tapped and everything. And he said, oh, that's outrageous. I said, it's outrageous, but it's the fact. So you're going to be a lawyer. You're probably going to be under scrutiny. I'm glad to meet you, but you have to figure it out yourself, whether you want to take what might be a risk. I gave him my phone number, and I never heard from him. His father was a lawyer. I suspect his father said, "Are you kidding?" This was in the
Dad might have stepped in, you think?
excuse me.
You think Dad might have stepped in?
Yeah, I would guess so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this was at the height of the Cold War. So let me tell you one other story about, and then I'll stop and we can have questions or whatever, to illustrate the fact that you can't predict the effect of a story, and you probably shouldn't try. When I was in Israel, 4 Palestinian terrorists hijacked a bus, kept the passengers hostage, and when the Army's SWAT team, which did rehearsals on storming the bus, went into the bus and rescued all the hostages except one. One got killed. Two, I'm going to try to make this short. There were four terrorists, 4 hijackers. 2 of them were killed during the assault. 2 were rescued alive and were beaten to death later by the Shin Bet, which is the Israeli internal secret police intelligence agency. I found out about this because 2 Israeli photographers had taken pictures of these 2 terrorists being led off the bus perfectly well. The military censor prohibited them from publishing the photographs, and I was subject to military censorship on such stories too. But this was too important, and I defied censorship. I ignored censorship. I sent the stories to the Times. They published them. I wrote one after another after another. At one point, the defense minister, Moshe Ahrens, asked me to please stop writing about it because he had soldiers in PLO hands in Lebanon and was afraid they'd be killed in retaliation. Well, it was too late then anyway for me to stop. But in any case, I wasn't about to cover up a double murder. So I kept writing, and I did have a few nervous weeks. Obviously, I didn't want Israeli soldiers to be killed, but I also figured that the crime was not mine, it was theirs. And it was very important to cover it and to write about it. The censor, by the way, never said boo to me. It used to be when I would make a mistake accidentally and violate censorship, the colonel, his name was Colonel Yehuda, would call me up and invite me for a cup of coffee. That's how I knew I was in trouble. So I would go and he would say, why didn't you submit the story to us in advance? And I said, really, that story? I mean, really? He said, yeah, suppose. Anyway, so this time he didn't say a word. I heard later it was because he was very angry that the authorities had abused the office of the censor to cover up a double murder, because the censor is supposed to protect sources and methods of intelligence, basically. And that, was over the line. So, yeah, then what happened? A commission was formed to investigate these murders. They named 8 or 10 Shin Bet agents who were responsible, including, I think, the head of the Shin Bet. The president of Israel, Chaim Herzog, pardoned them all in advance before they could be tried. And that was the end of it. But it wasn't the end of it, because many years later, I heard from a former military intelligence officer whom I had met in Washington, Israeli intelligence officer, that as a result of my stories, the Shin Bet had changed its procedures and was now under strict orders not to kill prisoners, which apparently they had done before, which I didn't know. So there was a good outcome of a story that could have had a really bad outcome. So you never know. And I think journalists have to follow their own ethics. I violated the law, but I knew that my ethics had to take precedence. Nothing happened to me as a result. They could have kicked me out. They could have put me in jail, I suppose. I was never afraid of that. But I think that it's important for responsible journalism to continue to report the stories without trying to go through hoops and contortions and figure out what the impact is going to be. There have been some stories in Washington that have been suppressed because government officials will say, you're going to have blood on your hands. This is going to destroy our intelligence capabilities. And by and large, what happens in those cases is reporters and editors might withhold specific identifying information about an agent, for example, because, why blow an agent, especially when the story, the thrust of the story isn't about the person's name. It's about what's going on. So anyway, that's my take on it. I'm going to stop there because I'm happy to go longer than 8 if you want, but that's basically my story. I've got other stories to tell you, but I'd love to have your questions and hear what you think.
Having discussed at the top your career as an author, as a journalist, I'm sure you have lots of stories, and I'm sure there are questions. Let me bow to our students from Albion College and ask if either Jerry or Mickey has a question you'd like to pose to Mr. Shipler.
I do, yeah. This was
Hi.
incredibly interesting, first of all, thank you.
Hi,
But
Mickey.
I wanted to ask you about in this new area, or this kind of new post-Trump era with wire press and all of these stories going on, that people tend to, as your anecdote with your friend, kind of disengage when they disagree with a subject. If you feel like that's kind of shifted the censorship from being like an external body saying no to more of like reporters kind of having to self-select for their audiences.
Well, that's a really interesting question. Well, I think you have, going back to the metaphor of the food, the good food and the bad food. I mean, I think the responsible news organizations, some of which I mentioned, I don't get the impression that reporters are selecting to please their audiences. I think that does happen in the more opinionated areas. But my sense is that they're not doing that. I hope not anyway. I don't think so. I think it's kind of let the chips fall where they may approach. I thought when you started asking your question, you were when you're talking about censorship, that you were going to end up with censorship by the audience, which does happen, of course, because because of the balkanized nature of media, online, social media platforms and so forth, we know the algorithms tend to direct you into areas you've already explored because the algorithms think that's what you want. I mean, I've gotten on very conservative email lists because, and I'm not conservative, you might be able to tell that.
Yes.
But I've gotten on really conservative email lists, I think mainly, I guess, because I've gone online, because I'm basically a journalist writer. I go online and explore all kinds of different views. So recently I've been getting lots of emails from the NRA, last chance to win a prize and donate and all that kind of stuff. So I think as a public, we do tend to censor ourselves in terms of we censor what we hear and what we read. That's bad because in a democracy, we have to have a shared reality. Otherwise, we're just going to lose our ability to govern ourselves. So, and I think the media don't help that because they tended to push us into the places where we're most comfortable politically.
Great point. I see a head nodding. Jerry, you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to say I really appreciate your perspective on all this. I think it's very interesting. My question to you would be kind of what and how has like the money played a role in news organizations and maybe more recent years than 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Well, that's a great question, Jerry, because I think news organizations are by and large in real serious financial trouble. You've had a closing of lots of local news organizations, local newspapers, which has left what some people call a media desert or a news desert. What that does is create vacuums in which government officials can abuse their authority because they won't get covered. Police departments can abuse their authority unless it becomes a national story, the way violence does. The lower kind of day in, day out misbehavior doesn't rise to the level of coverage. People don't know about it. It's almost impossible now for newspapers, local newspapers, to survive on the traditional income from advertising. So, for example, the New York Times gets most of its revenue, as I understand it, from subscriptions. That never used to be the case. It used to be that, for example, the Sunday newspaper, which used to when I was working there in the old days, cost 50 cents. The cost of the ink and the paper all by itself was 50 cents. So I was paying as a subscriber 50 cents for blank newspaper and blank ink and no labor. The paper was making its money from advertising, and it was print advertising. If you pick up the New York Times, a published print version of the New York Times today, you'll find hardly any advertising. And some of it is house ads, the Times itself publicizing itself, which is fine with me as a reader because I never, like to thread through the ads anyway. But the paper has really changed its system. It has, several years ago, more than several, I don't know exactly how many years ago, maybe 6, 7 years ago, they got some smart people in there and they realized that there was a confluence, there was a perfect storm. You had the economic downturn in 2008, which cut down on advertising, and you had the rise of the internet, which allowed people to get news online without paying for it. So the Times had to figure out how to make the internet, the online news, pay. They first gave it away, and then they started instituting paywalls. They first instituted a paywall for the columnists, couple of my friends who are columnists screamed bloody murder about that, Tom Friedman particularly, and they stopped that. And then they imposed a paywall for everything. I think you get maybe 3 or 4 or 5 articles a month free. And then you pay for a subscription online or both. I get both the print and online. There's advertising on the line too, but that's, and by the way, one thing Trump was right about was that the major news organizations have really profited from him. The Times subscriptions, I think, went during his term from 3 to 7 million or something. Now, I don't know what's happened since. I mean, I bet you they're going to drop off because controversy is always exciting and people want to read about it. It's like, people, when we were having tensions with the Soviet Union, more college students began to study Russian as a result. I would bet a lot of the Chinese is pretty popular now in colleges. I don't know that, but I did the research on Russian. I don't know about Chinese. My granddaughter, who's only 12, is studying Chinese in public school in Washington, D.C. So I think Chinese is, maybe, it's the same with the media. So that's, I think the finances are really serious, especially when it comes to local news.
David, I had a question. You spoke about how journalism changed during the Trump era as journalists were explaining, taking almost editorial positions to try and separate what they perceived as mistruths from the fact. And I think that probably is a trend that was dangerous. Now that we're in a different administration, do you think that that phenomenon will continue? Will it get worse? Will we get back to something that was sort of a pre-Trump normal? And if so, how and when?
Yeah. When I was at the New York Times, we were forbidden from using the future tense. So I'm reluctant to make predictions. I think I'm not in the business now, but I hear things. So what I've heard is that I'll just take the Times as an example. On the one hand, I think there's much less pressure to inject the judgment into the news stories. They do fact checking, which is great. Biden doesn't say everything that's true all the time, 100% of the time. It's nothing like Trump, but nevertheless, the fact checkers are there, and they're continuing to do that both at the Times. They do fact checking, and at the Washington Post. Glenn Kessler is a really good reporter I've known for years, slightly, and he does the fact checking for the Post, which I think counted 30,000 lies during Trump's administration or something. So, I mean, he's really good and responsible, and he's not biased. I think they'll continue to do that, and I think it's a good service. I've already noticed in the coverage less judgmental phrasing since Biden came in. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, from what I understand, because at the Times particularly, because they expanded their platforms tremendously and quickly, they've gone into podcasts and videos and all that. They had to do a lot of hiring from various media where the training in journalistic ethics was not what we got as reporters at the Times. And as a result, you're getting, I think, some erosion of those standards there. In addition, there's the woke generation feels very strongly about racism, misogyny, homophobia, and so forth. And that concern has definitely been imported by the younger people they've hired into the newsroom, so that you've seen people fired, from the Times. Donald McNeil was a case recently, the science reporter, despite his very good record as a reporter. James Bennett, the editor of the editorial page, for running a piece by Senator Tom Cotton advocating the military use against Black Lives Matter protesters, that sort of thing. It's been I think it's a less forgiving environment. I can't assess it that well from outside. I'm just telling you what I've heard. I think there's an atmosphere change. When I was at the paper, I had occasional editing issues that I thought were political, but they were very rare. And I mean, in 22 years, I can count maybe 4 or 5 of them where stories were either killed or changed in a way that I felt reflected some kind of bias on the part of the editors. And at the same time, the paper was very self-correcting. And I don't mean just published corrections, but corrections of process. I remember once reporting from Israel, I quoted a soldier who said something that was a little bit off color. It wasn't actually an obscenity, but he was reciting the images that many Israeli soldiers had of Palestinian Arabs. And he had a whole list of epithets. And one of them was sons of whores. And they included the quote in the paper, but they cut out that sons of whores. But they didn't break up the quote. They made it seem as if, it just went on that way. I complained. My argument was, if you don't like it, you take it out of quotation marks. A quotation is a fact. You can't change it. The reaction was by the managing editor or the news editor, one high editor, to send a memo around to the entire staff, reminding everybody that we do not change quotes. So that was the times that I knew, and I'm pretty sure it's the standards in that regard from editors I know are similar, but that doesn't mean that it's Simon Pure in terms of screening out judgments and opinions. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think people have gotten a little bit used to allowing themselves the license to express judgments in the news columns. The occasions haven't arisen as much now, but I worry about it. By the way, I see much less of it in the foreign coverage. It's much more prevalent. It's been much more prevalent in domestic issues in Washington coverage.
Mm.
You read stories from overseas, they're pretty straight and good, and they're, the Times now does a lot of team reporting, which we almost never did. We had, one byline, that was it. Maybe you got a little help from a colleague. Now they, multiple bylines are the rules. They do a lot of team reporting, and what that means is that they can do much deeper reporting, more investigative stuff, and they have more space because the ads are gone. So these stories run on and on, sometimes too long, I think. But nevertheless, they're rich in reporting, which makes the paper very, very useful, I think, and important.
David, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I sense that there may be another question or two for you. This is David Shipler, a longtime reporter for the New York Times, and our guest tonight on Our American Values, talking about journalism and separating news from analysis and editorial opinion. I'll ask my friends from Albion College whether either of you has another question.
So you kind of touched on it, especially in regards to foreign press. But do you believe external actors such as politicians and governments have a responsibility to be as unbiased as journalists are when they're talking about media in that way?
Oh, good one. Yes, of course I do. Absolutely. Look, I mean, people in my line of work are accustomed to being assailed. And I never minded being criticized for what I actually wrote. I mind being criticized for things that I don't write, or for things I've written that people don't read. I had a book that was temporarily removed from AP English courses in the Plymouth Canton School District several years ago, the working poor. It was ultimately put back, but it was clear to me from reading what the parent who was the prime mover in trying to get this book and others removed wrote, what she wrote and said in hearings, that she hadn't read it. She hadn't read the book. There are websites where you can get quotes and page numbers, that are supposedly offensive, and that's what she was going on. I have a relative who was an ardent Trump supporter who kept emailing me I write a blog. It's called the Shipler Report, which is opinionated, by the way. It is opinion. It's kind of luxurious for me to be able to write opinion after all the years when I couldn't. But anyway, so, he wrote a couple of emails in which he was criticizing me, and it was clear that he hadn't actually read what I had written. In fact, in one case, he said something that he said I hadn't said something, which I had actually said in the third paragraph. And I said, but I said it in the third paragraph. She said, oh, I stopped reading because I got so mad at you. So, I mean, and we, in my day before the internet, readers would write letters. In Israel, I got a lot of letters, some of them very critical. My basic policy was to answer every letter. The first time. Some people would write again and again and again, but the first time I would answer, and I would try to answer respectfully, because if somebody takes the trouble to do that, I figure, well, they do have a concern. And in fact, it did affect my reporting in certain respects, because one of the criticisms was made of me in Israel early on was that I was not including enough history in my reporting. So, and that part of the world is steeped in history. And so unless you recall, for example, the 1967 war and how the Israelis ended up, getting the West Bank and so forth, unless you recall how that all developed, you make it seem as if it just sort of materialized out of thin air. So I did try then to include at least a phrase or a sentence of historical context when I could. I mean, the fact is, every sentence about the past is one sentence less about the present, which is really what you're writing about. And editors are not especially patient with historical digressions. So, you had to try to measure it in some way carefully. But I think it's important for reporters to listen to the criticisms. If they're well-founded, take them seriously and adjust. But that doesn't mean, injecting political bias. There were times when I kind of felt that if I was getting attacked by both sides, I was probably doing my job fairly well.
Thank you very much, David. It's been great having you with us. This is a fascinating subject, and your career lends itself to storytelling and a lot of critical thinking, which is what my friends at Albion are all about, critical thinking. So thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your having me. And thanks to Mickey and Jerry for your good questions. And
Absolutely. Mickey Benson and Jerry Hasma from Albion College. Patrick McLean is still with us. He's the director of the Ford Institute at Albion. Thank you again for your help. In fact, you're the fellow that brought David to our attention and got him here. So thank you very much. Next month, please stick with me for a moment. Our next live session on the War Memorial's American Democracy series will be on Wednesday, April 21st at 7 p.m. We'll learn that night about the career of retired U.S. Senator Carl Levin, who has a new book just out from the Wayne State University Press. It's called Getting to the Heart of the Matter, My 36 Years in the Senate. Our guest that night will be Jim Townsend, who's director of the Levin Center at the law school at Wayne State University, where the senator is the chair of the Levin Center and distinguished legislator in residence. Jim is a former Michigan State representative, likely also to tell us about the work of the Levin Center, the mission of which is to strengthen the integrity, transparency, and accountability of public and private institutions by promoting and supporting bipartisan, fact-based oversight, by advancing good governance, particularly with respect to the legislative process, and promoting civil discourse. Civil discourse, we've forgotten about that in the last few years, on current issues of public policy. I hope you'll be with us on April 21st. It's going to be hard to top this one, David. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you all for being with us. Have a good night.
Yeah.
By the way, tell your friends that tonight's proceedings will be available on the War Memorial's website beginning in a day or so. so you can watch the whole thing over again or tell your friends who missed it that they missed something really good. Be with us April 21st. Have a great week and weekend, and enjoy spring wherever you are. Good night.
Good night. Thanks. Thank you all.